Hey, Emily, what's on your radar?
Well, too often we think of big tech as primarily an antitrust issue or primarily a censorship issue with little regard for the interplay between both of those problems. But what's worse, the politics of big tech drags us into these convoluted legalese and dense policy discussions that distract from the more immediate concern, which is both worse, it's more important, and it's easier to win on. It's a major public health threat on a scale we've never seen before. A ruling against Facebook this week struck, quote, a blow to big tech's claims of complete immunity from liability under Section 230. As, quote, the Texas Supreme Court ruled last week, Facebook can be held liable for state civil claims of sex trafficking on its platform, per my friend Rachel Bovard's take in The Federalist. Quote, Section 230 does not withdraw from states the authority to protect their citizens from internet companies whose own actions, as opposed to those of their users, amount to knowing or intentional participation in human trafficking, Judge Blacklock wrote. It's as good an example as any that Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg's lauded promises to facilitate societal harmony with their technology have fallen flat. To focus narrowly on Zuckerberg for just a moment, it's actually pretty stunning to search interviews he gave back in 2007 and 2008, which seems like ages ago, but proves how dramatically life has changed in such a short period of time. Listen to what he told Wired exactly 12 years ago on June 29th, 2009. When I started Facebook from my dorm room in 2004, the idea that my roommates and I talked about all the time was a world that was more open. We believed that people being able to share the information they wanted and having access to the information they wanted is just a better world. People can connect better with the people around them, understand more of what's going on with the people around them, and understand more in general. Also, openness fundamentally affects a lot of the core institutions in society: the media, the economy, how people relate to the government, and just their leadership. We thought that stuff was really interesting to pursue. Now, of course, ironically, Facebook is one of the least open institutions in the country at this point, but to call Zuckerberg's utopian technocratic fantasy naive would not do it justice. Now that naivete has morphed into cynicism as Zuck and his fellow oligarchs mine the carcass of their long-dead fantasy for profit. The Backpage example Rachel wrote about in the context of 230 is an instructive one. They never anticipated how their inventions would be used, though they should have, but now they know, and they're completely at a loss for how to deal with that. And that's because dealing with it meaningfully would involve taking a big hit. The excesses of the openness Zuckerberg and his fellow travelers promised, like the Backpage case Rachel highlighted, those are just the tip of the iceberg here. Tech can be abused, sure, but it's also fundamentally abusive. Yesterday, GQ published an interview with Asa Raskin. Raskin invented the infinite scroll. He doesn't use social media much, as you can imagine. Quote, for many people, he said, it's become part of their job or the way they support themselves, part of the way they stay in contact with their friends or their family or loved ones around the world. That's what's inhumane, that we are forced to use systems which are fundamentally unsafe for the things that we need, Raskin added. Technology is not just ripping apart the social fabric, it's replacing our social fabric with something much more brittle. There are two things in that statement to pay very close attention to. The first is the point that we are forced to use this system, and there's no way around that. Our norms have shifted to the point where there's basically it's not plausible to live your life without some connection onto these platforms, and two, that those platforms are bad. TikTok is a good example. Surely you've encountered an example of the trendy explainer videos that gain viral momentum. They expose many of our students and our teachers and our parents as vapid clowns with an incredible amount of self-confidence. But TikTok rewards it because social media engineers have consciously programmed us to react in ways that increase engagement on bad content, thereby incentivizing the bad mindsets that create and reward it. It's changing us. This again is downstream of the public health point. Raskin co-founded the Center for Humane Technology along with Tristan Harris, who you may remember from the Netflix documentary The Social Dilemma. Harris has compared tech to, quote, big tobacco for our brains, in the sense that it's addictive and the industry profits off our addiction. But tobacco wasn't a major mode of communication, political discourse, professional life, and social life all wrapped into one thing. 3 billion people have a brain implant that's remotely controlled, that's a remotely controlled brain because, especially in the coronavirus times, we are relying on these things to make sense of reality out there in the world, Harris said just last fall. They have become the fabric for our sense-making and the fabric of our choice-making, the fabric of how children develop. University of Michigan professor Daniel Kruger told The Guardian, quote, "There are whole departments trying to design their systems to be as addictive as possible. They want you to be permanently online and by bombarding you with messages and stimuli, trying to redirect your attention back to their app or web page." We are barely 20 years into this grand experiment and the guinea pigs are not faring so well. Harris and Raskin's group keep a ledger of harms on their website, summarizing peer-reviewed studies on tech's harms. I'm just going to read a few of them. The level of social media use on a given day is linked to a significant correlated increase in memory failure the next day. 3 months after starting to use a smartphone, users experience a significant decrease in their mental arithmetic scores and a significant increase in social conformity. The greater your level of Facebook addiction, the lower your brain volume. The mere presence of a mobile phone can disrupt the connection between two people, leading to reduced feelings of empathy, trust, and a sense of closeness. The more that someone treats an AI like Siri as if it has human qualities, the more they later dehumanize actual humans and treat them poorly. That's just a few of them. From the printing press to the mirror to the camera, human life has long been disrupted in dramatic ways by technologies and inventions, many of which we now recognize as positive creations. But smartphones and social media are rewiring our brains on an enormous scale, and not for the better, and people are making a lot of money off of it. The research is mounting. This is much bigger than Section 230. It's bigger than antitrust, although it's certainly still partially a consequence of market dominance. This is not just a public health issue. This is a public health emergency. But what's so dangerous about this particular emergency is that the source of the emergency is dulling our senses and coaxing us into complacency with the carefully curated stream of colorful notifications. It's sapping our ability to fight back. And that's why we're bickering about Facebook regulations on Facebook, and I'm here whining about it on YouTube. They've already won, which means they're rich enough to get the hell off their own services, and that is exactly what they're doing. So, Ryan, I think the way that Raskin lays this out in that, on the one hand, these technologies are inescapable. They have become ingrained into the fabric of life to the point where you can't really live a normal life and exist in society and function in it, especially if you're under a certain age demographic, because everyone is using it without being on social media. And then on the second hand, social media is purposely designed to create addictions and to change our brains. How does that not constitute a public health emergency? How do we not talk about it in those terms?
It does sound like a public health emergency. Then the question is, what do we do about it? And if, as one of the people made the point, the goal of a lot of these profit-seeking companies is to get you as addicted as possible to their product and keep you salivating at that ping coming back to their app, then it feels like the only solution there is to take the profit motive out of it.
Right.
And which would require either regulating these social apps as utilities or just nationalizing them outright. Now, I don't know what you would do if you'd have to also ban competitors, I guess.
Yeah.
Because if you, let's say you nationalize or regulate Instagram as a utility, what do you do about TikTok? And then what do you do about products that come out and say, all right, well, you're only using now that we've made Instagram a healthier product, you're only using it a half an hour a day. Mm-hmm. So here's a product you can use all day long.
And it also creates an enormous problem in terms of the precedent, because there are foods that are obviously designed to be addictive. I mean, you can draw this line to salt, right? Like, you can literally start talking about how restaurants and food companies add salt to their products so that people can't stop eating them, and eating them is bad for them. And, the responsibility is on the consumer in that case to just stop stuffing their face with Doritos, which can be difficult, to be fair. But it creates this weird legal situation conversation, and like just imagine having like something like the FDA start getting involved in these conversations. It's a total mess. And Zuckerberg, like the Backpage example is amazing because it's like, how are you Mark Zuckerberg sitting in your dorm room and not even thinking about something like that? I get that you were just a college kid creating this thing, you didn't know where it would take off, but it seems so obvious that it was going to go in that direction. It was going to go in a direction where it could be abused. But then at the same time, these things are actually designed. Like I didn't even get into what's happened to Gen Z, people who grew up with smartphones and don't know the world before smartphones, the way that it's affected their mental health. I mean, the research is terrifying. It's terrifying, and we may never be able to go back to a time before our brains were treated this way.
And the problem with saying that it's on the consumer to show self-restraint would be like saying that it's the problem is not with the nets in the ocean, it's on the dolphins to stop getting themselves stuck in those. You're like, dolphins are pretty smart. Like, hey guys, stop getting stuck in the nets. And you're like, then you take it back and you're like, actually no, like we need to do something about the nets. Like this is a systemic problem. We can't count on heroes.
And that's why it's downstream of antitrust, because it's much easier to avoid a McDonald's than it is to avoid Facebook. And that may sound ridiculous, especially to older people, but that's actually very, very true for people who are of a certain age demographic. It's how, for instance, like I've had Facebook used in classes before because everybody's on it. So it's the mode of communication that your groups use when you do breakout activities. And if you don't have Facebook, life just becomes very difficult. And so we've all just been forced and pushed into these things. Even if you try to resist them, it's enormously difficult. How are you supposed to just resist Gmail? Tristan Harris, who's one of the founders of the Center for Humane Technology that we talked about, he was designing Gmail. Like he came out of Gmail because they were trying to make people spend more time on their Gmails. Mm-hmm. What are you going to do? Use another mail service that's also doing the exact same thing for your email? These technologies are just inescapable, and there's no competitor that's going to rise. There's no room for a competitor to rise up in a way that would, really, really, unless this is just a very extended adjustment period, and somebody has a brilliant idea that's going to come up in a couple of years, though we haven't seen it yet. Who's going to meaningfully be able to compete in the space when you have these monopolies?
Right. I think you're right. We got to nationalize and ban for-profit social media.
Ban for-profit social media. Hey, yeah. I mean, it is basically like making money off tobacco. That leads to all of these different regulatory avenues or roads for regulatory avenues. We've done this before, but I think in particular with social media, it opens up an enormous can of worms. And at the same time, I think the information at this point has become very clear that it's an emergency. We don't even talk about it like it's an emergency, though, because, who wants to think about that?
Yeah, it's a mess.
Well, I'm looking forward to seeing what's on your radar next, Ryan.
There we go.